The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1878, trailing a cloud of red dust and the kind of silence that falls over a town when something unexpected arrives. And Lillian Boone stepped down from that coach like a woman who had already decided she would not apologize for a single word she was about to say. She was 26 years old, carrying a leather satchel in one hand and a carpetbag in the other, wearing a traveling dress the color of sage that had seen better days but still held itself with dignity. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her eyes, a clear, steady gray-green, like river water over flat stone, swept the main street of Harlan Creek with the kind of calm assessment that made people feel they were being read. Harlan Creek, Nevada, was not a remarkable town by any measure. It had grown up fast in the aftermath of the silver rush of the early 1870s, the way so many towns did, like weeds after rain, not because anyone particularly loved the place, but because the silver was there, and money has a way of building walls around itself. By 1878, the rush had softened into a steady trickle, and the town had settled into the comfortable arrangement that prosperity invites: a hierarchy, a set of unspoken rules, and a handful of men who had grown very accustomed to the sound of their own voices going unchallenged. There was Amos Headley, who owned the town's only bank and had a handshake so carefully calculated it told you everything about the deal before a word was spoken. There was Sheriff Dale Prout, a wide man with a wider mustache, who kept the peace the way a man keeps a fire, by deciding which things were allowed to burn. There was Gerald Fitch, who owned the mercantile and half the land on the east side of town, and who considered himself the moral compass of Harlan Creek primarily because no one had ever pointed out that a compass only works if it is honest. And there was the Harlan Creek Gazette, 3 pages long, printed twice a week, edited by a man named Cyrus Platt who considered the truth a suggestion rather than a mandate. Lillian Boone had come to take over the Gazette. The previous editor, a man named Herschel Webb, had died of a fever 6 weeks prior, and he had left the paper and the building it occupied, a narrow 2-story structure on the west end of Main Street, to his niece, whom he had apparently corresponded with regularly, admired greatly, and trusted with the conviction of a man who had spent enough years printing half-truths to feel deep respect for someone who refused to do the same. Lillian had worked at a newspaper in Sacramento for 4 years, writing under the name L. Boone because the editor there had told her, with genuine regret and no particular embarrassment, that people did not trust a woman's byline on hard news. She had written under L. Boone and done the work and learned every inch of typesetting, layout, reporting, and the particular art of asking a question that a person cannot answer without revealing more than they intended. She had not known what to expect of Harlan Creek. Her uncle's letters had been warm but careful, the way letters are when a man loves someone and does not want to worry them. She had read them twice each, between the lines as much as on them, and she had packed her bags with the understanding that she was going somewhere that would require her full attention. She was not wrong. The first man who spoke to her on the street was Gerald Fitch, who had apparently been watching the stagecoach arrive from the window of his mercantile. He came out with his thumbs in his vest pockets and a smile that was a size too large for the welcome it was supposed to convey. "Miss Boone," he said, and he said it the way a man says a name when he is testing the weight of it. "Gerald Fitch, I knew your uncle." "I know who you are, Mr. Fitch," Lillian said pleasantly. "My uncle mentioned you. He said you paid your advertising account 4 months late every time, as regular as a clock." The smile shrank exactly one size. "Is that right?" "It is." "I expect we can come to a better arrangement going forward." He laughed, because he did not yet understand that she was serious, and he told her he hoped she would find the town welcoming, and she thanked him and kept walking toward her uncle's building. And behind her she could hear the quiet rustle of the small crowd that had assembled to watch the arrival reforming itself around this new information about the kind of woman who had come to Harlan Creek. Roy Graves was not in that crowd. He was at the edge of town, 3 streets back, in the small paddock behind the livery stable where he kept his horse, a 16-year-old bay quarter horse named Dusk, who had survived 3 cattle drives, 2 floods, and 1 incident involving a rattlesnake and a narrow canyon that Roy did not like to think about. Roy was brushing Dusk's flank with the long, easy strokes of a man who does his thinking with his hands, and he had heard the stagecoach arrive the way he heard most things. He registered it, filed it, and went on with what he was doing. Roy Graves was 30 years old. He had come to Harlan Creek 2 years earlier after 10 years of ranch work across Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, carrying nothing but his horse, his saddle, a good rifle, a bedroll, and the quiet reputation of a man who was useful and did not cause trouble. He had taken a job as a cattle hand on the Whitmore Ranch 6 miles north of town, and he came into Harlan Creek on Saturdays for supplies, and on the occasional evening when the bunkhouse felt too close, and the saloon offered the particular solitude that comes from being alone in a crowd. He was not a man of many words, but the words he used tended to be the right ones. He had brown eyes that were easy to underestimate. They looked soft until they were focused on you, and then you understood they had been paying attention to everything all along. He was lean and sun-darkened, with hands that showed every year of the work they had done, and a stillness about him that some people found comfortable and some found unnerving, depending entirely on what they were trying to hide. He did not hear about Lillian Boone that Tuesday, or Wednesday, or Thursday. He heard about her on Friday, when he came into Fitch's Mercantile to pick up a sack of coffee and a new pair of work gloves, and Fitch himself was behind the counter with the expression of a man who has been chewing on something sour for several days. Heard the Gazette's got a new editor, Roy said, because Fitch was clearly waiting to be asked. Herschel's niece, Fitch said. Woman from Sacramento. Thinks she knows this town already. Roy picked up a tin of coffee and turned it in his hands, checking the label. Does she? She asked me about my account the day she arrived, Fitch said, and Roy could hear in his voice both the indignation and the guilty awareness that the woman had been correct, before she'd even seen the inside of the building. Were you late? Fitch's jaw tightened. That's not the point. Roy set down the tin and looked at him. Seems like it might be. He paid for his supplies and left, and on the way back to his horse, he passed the 2-story building on the west end of Main Street, where a sign was already being repainted, fresh black letters replacing faded ones, the word Gazette emerging clean and new from the old wood. A ladder leaned against the front wall, and at the top of it, entirely focused on the work of painting the last letters with a careful, steady hand, was a woman in a work apron over her traveling dress, her hat hung on a nail nearby so it would not be in the way. Roy slowed. He watched for a moment. He was not thinking anything in particular. He was simply looking, the way a man looks at something that interests him without yet knowing why. Then she finished the last letter, leaned back to examine her work, made a small sound of satisfaction and began climbing down the ladder. She reached the ground, turned, and found him watching. She did not seem startled. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him with those gray-green eyes that he could see now up close were even steadier than they'd appeared from a distance. Passing through or stopping for a reason, she asked. I was looking at the sign, he said. It was the truth, and something in the way he said it without elaboration or apology made something shift slightly in her expression. Roy Graves, he said. I work the Whitmore Ranch. Lillian Boone, she said. I run this paper. A pause. What did you think of the sign? Straight, he said. Most people can't to the right when they're working at height. You went level the whole way. She looked back at the sign, then at him. You were watching that carefully. I tend to watch things, he said. It came out more personal than he'd intended, and he felt it, and apparently she did too, because there was a moment between them that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. It was something else, something that hadn't been named yet. Well, she said, if you have occasion to read the Gazette, Mr. Graves, I hope you'll find it worth your time. I'll make occasion, he said, and then he picked up Dusk's reins and rode out of town, and Lillian Boone watched him go for about 3 seconds before she went back inside to set the first typeface she would use in Harlan Creek. The first issue of the Gazette under Lillian's editorship came out the following Tuesday, and it was read by virtually every person in town before noon. Not because the town had been particularly devoted to the paper under Herschel Webb's management. He had been a decent man and a careful writer, but he had also been very conscious of which men controlled the flow of money in Harlan Creek, and his coverage had reflected that consciousness. But because word had gotten around that Herschel's niece had some opinions, and people are always drawn to the spectacle of someone saying a thing they've been told not to say. The front page carried 3 stories. The first was a straightforward account of the latest silver assay numbers from the local mines, and what they meant for the town's economic outlook: clear, factual, with none of the optimistic vagueness that usually accompanied such reports when the numbers were merely adequate rather than impressive. The second was a notice about the condition of the road between Harlan Creek and the neighboring town of Culver, which had washed out badly in the spring rains and had not been repaired despite 2 town council votes authorizing funds for the work. Lillian had spoken with the county road supervisor, who confirmed that the funds had been allocated, and with 3 separate freight drivers who confirmed the road was still impassable, and she had asked, in print, in plain and polite language, where the money had gone. The third story was about Thomas and Clara Yee. Thomas Yee had come to Nevada with the railroad construction crews in the early 1860s, and after the railroad was complete he had stayed, because going back was not a simple thing, and because he had, over the years, built a laundry business in Harlan Creek that was by any measure a successful and honest enterprise. His wife Clara ran the front counter. Their 2 sons, who were 16 and 14, helped after school. They were a family that kept to themselves not by preference, but by the instruction of a town that had never fully decided how to regard them. 3 weeks before Lillian arrived, someone had painted slurs on the wall of the Yee's laundry in the middle of the night, and the following day Sheriff Prout had told Thomas Yee that he had not seen anything and could not investigate what he had not seen, and that he suggested the family paint over the words and not make a fuss. Lillian had knocked on the Yee's door on her second day in town. She had introduced herself, told them who she was, and asked if she could tell their story. Thomas Yee had looked at her for a long time with the careful expression of a man who has been promised things before and knows what disappointment tastes like. His wife Clara had said, "If you're going to tell it, tell all of it. Don't soften it until it lies." "I won't," Lillian had said, and she hadn't. The story named no suspects because she had none, but it named every fact: the date, the nature of the vandalism, the sheriff's response, and the broader context of how the Yees had been treated by a town that used their services without extending them the ordinary dignities of citizenship. She wrote it without sentiment but with complete clarity, and it was the story that people were discussing when Roy Graves rode into town that Tuesday to pick up the Gazette along with his weekly supplies. He read it sitting on the bench outside Fitch's Mercantile, the paper folded in his hands, the sun warm on his back. He read it slowly, which was how he read everything. When he was finished, he sat for a moment and then he read the piece about the road funds, and then the assay numbers, and then he folded the paper and put it in his saddlebag and went in to buy his coffee. Fitch was behind the counter again, and 3 other men were in the store, and they were all talking about the paper. Not admiringly. "She'll make enemies before she makes friends," Fitch was saying. "She's made enemies already," said a man named Carl Briggs who worked as a clerk at the bank. "Mr. Headley is not pleased. About the road story. About all of it. He says a woman who's been in town a week has no business telling people how things work here." "She didn't tell anyone how things work," Roy said from the doorway. They all looked at him. "She asked where the money went. That's a different thing." There was a silence. Fitch opened his mouth and then closed it, Carl Briggs looked at the floor with the expression of a man who works for someone with strong opinions. "You read it?" Fitch asked, as though this were the mildly surprising element. "I did. The road piece, the ye piece, the assay numbers." He set his money on the counter for the coffee. "She writes well, clear." He left, and behind him the conversation resumed in a lower register, and it was the first of several such moments in which Roy Graves would find himself the only voice in a room saying anything in Lillian Boone's direction that was not complaint or warning. He did not plan this. It simply happened because he read the paper and found it accurate and said so when it came up, the way he would say any true thing when it came up, without particular calculation. But in a town where most men were measuring their words against the opinions of Headley and Fitch and Prout, the absence of that calculation stood out. The second issue of the Gazette was more inflammatory than the first, if only because by then the men of Harlan Creek had had time to understand that Lillian Boone was not a one-time novelty, but a permanent condition they were going to have to reckon with. The road money, it turned out, had been redirected, not stolen outright, but quietly reallocated to a grading project on the road that ran past Amos Headley's property, which Lillian reported with the same careful factuality she brought to everything, and which caused Amos Headley to visit the Gazette office in person for the first time on the Thursday following the paper's release. Lillian was at the typesetting case when he arrived, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her fingers stained with ink. She was a small woman, but she had the quality of taking up the right amount of space, and when Headley walked in with his good coat and his silver watch chain and his expression of magnanimous patience, she turned from the typesetting case and gave him the same level look she gave everyone. "Mr. Headley," she said, "I expected you on Wednesday." He was, she could see, slightly thrown by this. He had expected surprise or deference, or at least the social gymnastics of a woman not quite sure how to handle a man of his standing. He got instead a woman who had anticipated him. "Miss Boone." He removed his hat. He was, she noticed, performing respect rather than feeling it, the way a man does when he needs something and knows the direct approach will not work. "I thought we might have a conversation about the direction of the paper." "The paper's direction is accurate reporting," she said. "What specifically would you like to discuss?" "The piece about the road funds was incomplete." "In what way?" "You didn't include my statement." "You didn't give me one," she said. "I wrote to you Tuesday morning requesting comment." "I published on Tuesday evening. I gave you all day." She turned back to the typesetting case. "You're welcome to give me a statement now for the next issue." He watched her work for a moment. She could feel him recalibrating. "I'm a friend of this town," he said, "and I'd like to be a friend to this paper." "Then tell me truthfully where the road allocation went and why," she said, not unkindly, "and I'll print it exactly as you say." He left without giving a statement, and Lillian went on setting type. And outside the narrow window of the Gazette office, the town of Harlan Creek continued to conduct its business with the slightly elevated hum of a place that has a new variable in its equation and has not yet decided what to do about it. Roy came to town again that Saturday, and this time he had a reason to stop at the Gazette that was not entirely manufactured. He had a question about the assay piece, a specific question about which mine superintendent she had spoken with, because there was something in the numbers that didn't match what he'd been hearing from men who worked out near the Cassidy shaft, and he thought it might matter. He knocked on the door of the Gazette office and she opened it, and for a second they both did the thing people do when they see someone they have thought about since the last time they saw them, a slight gathering of expression, a very small adjustment, as though settling into a posture that is both natural and deliberately chosen. "Mr. Graves," she said, "I had a question about your assay piece," he said. "If you have a minute." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He had never been in a newspaper office before. It was smaller than he'd expected, the front room dominated by the press, a magnificent old Washington hand press that her uncle had bought second-hand in 1869 and kept in meticulous condition, the ink trays and typesetting cases along one wall, a work table covered in proof pages and pencil marks. It smelled of ink and paper and the faint ghost of lamp oil. She showed him the notes from the assay piece. She kept good notes, organized, dated, names and figures written clearly in a notebook that she handled with the ease of someone who considers her records an extension of her thinking. They sat at the work table, the notebook between them, and he told her what he'd heard from the Cassidy shaft workers, and she listened the way she apparently listened to everything completely, without interrupting, without showing impatience or hurrying toward the conclusion she suspected he was building toward. When he finished, she said, "So the numbers I was given for the Cassidy shaft output may have been understated. By a third, maybe. The men I talked to, would they speak to me?" He thought about this. Some of them might. Pete Calloway definitely would. He's not afraid of anything and he's got no reason to cover for the superintendent. "Could you introduce me?" He looked at her. The question was practical, but there was something else in it. She was asking him to vouch for her in a place where she had no standing yet, and she was doing it directly, without pretense. He liked this. He liked it more than he was quite ready to admit. "Saturday week," he said. "I'll be at the Cassidy shaft visiting Calloway anyway. You could ride out with me." "I have a horse," she said, which he had not asked, and which suggested she'd heard an assumption in his offer that he hadn't intended and was correcting it anyway, and for some reason this made him want to smile. "Good," he said. 8 in the morning. He left, and she stood in the Gazette office for a long moment after he'd gone, looking at the open notebook on the work table, and she was smiling without entirely meaning to. The week between that conversation and the Saturday ride was not uneventful. Harlan Creek, it turned out, had more stories in it than the 3 that had appeared in Lillian's first issue, and they were not all of equal gravity, but they were all true, and she found them the way a good reporter finds stories, by talking to people, listening, following small threads until they led somewhere. She spoke to the women of the town, who told her things with the particular fluency of people who have never been asked their opinion before. She spoke to the men who worked the mines, who told her other things with the guarded carefulness of people who know their livelihoods depend on men who would prefer they stay quiet. She spoke to Clara Yee again, and to the preacher, Reverend Mills, who was a good man in the way that some men in frontier towns are good. Quietly, consistently, without expectation of reward or recognition, and who told her the history of Harlan Creek with the candor of someone who had been watching it for a decade and was relieved to finally have a listener. She did not speak to Sheriff Pruitt again after their first encounter, which had been brief and unpleasant. Pruitt had come to the Gazette office the morning after the first issue with the kind of large, slow energy that men in authority sometimes use to communicate displeasure without actually saying the words. He had told her that the Yee piece was the sort of story that caused trouble in a town, and she had asked him to specify what kind of trouble he meant, and he had told her some things were better left alone, and she had told him that in her experience, things that were better left alone were generally things that were unjust, and that the people with power to address them preferred not to. He had told her she would find Harlan Creek less welcoming if she kept on. She had thanked him for his time and held the door for him. So the Thursday before the Saturday ride, when someone broke the front window of the Gazette office at 2 in the morning, it was possible, even likely, that it was connected, though possible and likely were not the same as provable, and Lillian was a woman who understood the difference. She swept up the glass herself, tacked a board over the window frame, and in the morning she wrote a small notice for the next issue noting the event factually and without accusation, which was in some ways more damning than any accusation would have been. Roy heard about the window from a ranch hand who'd been in town that Thursday and came back to the bunkhouse with the news like a man delivering a verdict. Roy had been mending fence and he stopped, and he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon without speaking. He rode into town that evening, which he did not usually do on a Thursday. He went to the Gazette office and knocked, and Lillian opened the door with a lamp in her hand and ink on her fingers and the alert expression of someone who has been breaking a story. "The window," he said. "I've dealt with it." "I know." He looked at the boarded frame. It was solid work. She had cut the board to fit cleanly and nailed it evenly. "I wasn't coming to fix it." "Then why did you come?" He thought about this in his honest, careful way. "To see that you were all right." She looked at him for a long moment, holding the lamp. The light fell warm and unsteady across her face and made her eyes very clear. "I'm all right," she said, "but I appreciate the asking." They stood in the doorway for a moment that extended itself just slightly past what was socially conventional, neither of them pulling away from it. "The Cassidy shaft," he said finally, "still 8 in the morning." "I'll be ready," she said. He rode back to the ranch in the dark, and the stars over Nevada were extraordinary in the way they always were in late spring, and he was aware of something moving in him that had been still for a long time. The ride to the Cassidy shaft took just over an hour, and they talked the whole way, which surprised both of them. Roy was not a talker, and Lillian, though she was professionally practiced at extracting conversation from others, was not accustomed to being in a conversation she did not have to work to sustain. It went easily, the way things go easily when two people are genuinely interested in what the other is thinking. She asked him about the cattle work, not the romantic version, but the real version, the daily labor of it, the distances and the weather and the economics. He told her about the drives he'd done, the years in Arizona when the drought had been so severe that men had done things they were not proud of, and some of them had not come back from who they'd been before. She asked about the Whitmore Ranch, and he told her about the land. He was not a man of many words in general, but he had language for land, for the way the light came across the valley in the morning and the smell of the sage after a desert rain, and the particular quality of silence in a canyon that has been there for 10,000 years. She told him about Sacramento, about the years of writing under L. Boone, and what that had cost her in small, quiet ways, not dramatic injustice, but the steady drip of being told, over and over in a dozen different registers, that her presence was conditional. About her uncle's letters, which she had read and reread, and the feeling when she'd arrived in Harlan Creek and seen the Gazette building for the first time, slightly run-down but hers. "Do you plan to stay?" he asked. They were riding through a stretch of juniper that gave the landscape a sharp, clean smell in the morning air, and she turned her head to look at him when he asked, and there was something in the question beyond its literal meaning that she heard and he knew she heard. "Yes," she said. "I plan to stay." They reached the Cassidy shaft and found Pete Calloway, who was a big, straightforward man with hands the size of dinner plates, and the kind of directness that comes from years of work that does not tolerate anything but precision. He shook Lillian's hand as though there were nothing unusual about it, sat down on a timber balk outside the shaft entrance, and talked for an hour and a half about the production numbers and the superintendent, and the way the books were being kept in a manner that would not bear close examination. Lillian wrote everything down in her notebook in her fast, clear script. She asked questions that were specific and intelligent, and Calloway answered them with increasing frankness as he understood that she was not going to simplify or sensationalize what he told her. When they were finished, he looked at her notebook and then at Roy. "She's straight," he said to Roy, as though confirming something he'd thought. "I know," Roy said. The story about the Cassidy shaft assay numbers ran in the following Tuesday's Gazette, and it was the most significant piece Lillian had yet written. It named the superintendent, Franklin Morse, directly, with specific figures and the names of workers who would corroborate them. The story laid out, in plain and methodical language, the way the numbers had been manipulated to reduce the royalties owed to the mine's investors who were, ironically, largely the same wealthy men of Harlan Creek who had been most opposed to Lillian's presence, including Amos Headley. This created an interesting situation. Headley's indignation at Lillian and his financial interest were suddenly in direct conflict, and financial interest, as it almost always does, won. He sent a man to the Gazette that Tuesday afternoon with a message saying that he considered the story to be public service journalism and that he wished to settle his advertising account in full. Lillian accepted payment and printed a receipt and felt the complex, particular satisfaction of a story that had served its purpose, not personal vindication, but the actual function of what a newspaper could be, which was a tool for people to understand what was happening around them. She also felt something else, something she was not yet naming but which had been accumulating over the past 2 weeks with the steadiness of interest on a debt, a consciousness of a brown-eyed man on a bay horse who had come to check on her after the window was broken and who had sat easy and quiet on a timber balk while Pete Calloway confirmed something Roy had already known about her. He was at the Gazette office again on Thursday. This time he brought coffee, 2 cups from the hotel dining room 2 streets over, carried carefully, a small impracticality that she recognized as an attempt at something. She accepted hers and they sat at the work table in the comfortable mess of the newspaper office and drank coffee and talked. She showed him the proof pages for Tuesday's issue, not because she needed his opinion, but because she found she wanted to share it with someone, and specifically with him. He read carefully, the way he did everything, and he found a transposition error in the mine production table that she had missed, and she corrected it with her pencil and thanked him, and he said it was nothing, and she said it was not nothing, and the conversation turned, as their conversations were turning, into something with a warmth in it that went beyond information. "Are you worried?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked her this, and she understood that he was not asking about the paper. He was asking about the window, about Pruitt's visit, about the accumulating friction of being a woman who said true things in a town where true things were inconvenient. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. "Not worried the way you mean," she said. "I know what I'm doing. I know there are people who'd rather I wasn't here. Yes. But I'm not going to not do the work because it makes someone uncomfortable." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "My uncle did this for 20 years. He built this paper and this press and this, all of this." She gestured at the office with its beautiful, battered equipment. "He didn't always say what needed saying. I think that cost him. I think he knew it." She paused. "I'm going to do what he couldn't." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He must have been very proud of you." The simplicity of it, the directness of it, the way he said it, not as flattery but as observation, did something to her that she had not expected. She looked at him and he was looking back steadily, with those brown eyes that had been paying attention from the beginning, and she felt the space between them as something vivid and present. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. He stood to go, and at the door he turned and said, "I'll be in town next Saturday. I thought, if you had no prior engagement, the hotel dining room serves a good supper on Saturday evenings." She looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment that was so entirely her own. "Are you asking me to supper, Mr. Graves?" "I am," he said. "Then yes," she said. "I accept." He left and she stood in the office and pressed her hand briefly against the work table and breathed, and then she went back to setting type, but the smile stayed with her for the rest of the day. In the following days, the town of Harlan Creek took notice of Roy Graves and Lillian Boone the way small towns take notice of such things, not loudly, but thoroughly. The fact that a ranch hand from the Whitmore spread was keeping company with the woman who had in 3 weeks of residence caused more disruption to the established order of Harlan Creek than anyone had managed in years was not lost on anyone. Fitch mentioned it to Pruitt over a game of cards at the saloon. Pruitt said that Graves was a steady hand, and it was a shame he was spending time with a woman who was going to bring trouble down on herself eventually, and Fitch agreed with the assessment if not the apparent sympathy. Carl Briggs mentioned it to Mr. Headley, who had by now entered the complicated position of being both a beneficiary of Lillian's journalism and deeply uneasy about what she might write next, and Headley said that Roy Graves was old enough to make his own choices and left it there. The women of the town, who had collectively formed a much more positive view of Lillian than the men had, and who had been watching Roy Graves for 2 years with the assessment that he was steady, kind, and entirely too solitary, were mostly pleased. Clara Yee told her husband that she thought it was good, and that the man seemed to see Lillian clearly, which was what mattered. The preacher's wife, Martha Mills, told Reverend Mills that she had seen them riding out toward the Cassidy shaft together, and that the way the cowboy sat his horse next to hers suggested a man who was paying attention to something he did not want to lose. Saturday's supper at the hotel dining room was not elaborate. The hotel in Harlan Creek was a functional establishment, not a grand one, and the dining room ran to beefsteak and biscuits and good strong coffee and pie that varied in quality depending on what was fresh. But Lillian wore the second-best dress she had brought, which was a deep blue wool that she had bought for a newspaper dinner in Sacramento and worn twice, and Roy had clean clothes and had combed his hair. And they sat at a corner table with the low lamp between them and talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything. She told him about her family. Her father had been a school teacher in Ohio. Her mother had died when she was 12, and she had raised herself partly in her father's classroom and partly in the town's small newspaper office, where she had started sweeping floors at 13 and reading every piece of type before she said it. He told her about his family, a ranch in eastern Nevada where he had grown up, his father a hard man in the way of the land more than of cruelty, his mother a woman who had read to him every night of his childhood and who had died the winter he was 19, and how he had left after that because staying was too full of her absence. They talked about what they believed. Not religion, exactly, though Roy had a quiet faith in something he could not precisely name and Lillian had a rigorous ethics that served the same structural function, but about what they thought mattered, what they thought people owed each other, what they thought a life should be used for. "I think about Herschel a lot," she said at one point over the pie, which was apple and was good. "He built something real here. He compromised toward the end. I don't think he wanted to, but I think the pressure wore on him. And now I'm here and I get to decide if I'm going to do the same thing." "You won't," he said. "You're confident about that." "I've read your paper for a month," he said. "You write like someone who'd rather burn the press than compromise it." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, and it was a wonderful sound, warm and completely unguarded, and it did something to his chest that he was going to have to deal with later when he had time to think carefully. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me since I arrived," she said. "It's not a compliment," he said. "It's just what I see. You see things clearly, Mr. Graves." "Roy," he said. She looked at him over the table. "Roy," she said, and the name in her voice was something entirely different from what it was when anyone else said it. Walking back to the Gazette office after supper, the May night warm and the sky enormous over the street with its oil lamps burning amber in the dark, they walked close enough that the backs of their hands brushed twice, and then a third time, and on the third time neither of them moved away. At the door of the Gazette office she turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her, and there was a long moment in which Harlan Creek existed around them, its sounds, its smells, the distant laugh from the saloon, and yet felt very far away. "Thank you," she said, "for supper. For the Cassidy shaft, for the coffee on Thursdays." "I'll be in town next Thursday," he said. "I know," she said. She was smiling. He was smiling too, though his version of it was a small, private thing that very few people had ever seen. He touched the brim of his hat. She went inside. He stood in the street for a moment looking at the Gazette office with its boarded window. The new glass was being cut in Reno and would arrive next week. And then he walked to the livery where Dusk was stabled and rode home in the dark. And he was thinking about nothing except a woman with gray-green eyes who wrote the truth and received it with the same steady courage. The month of May brought more stories and more friction. The third issue ran a piece on the conditions in the mine workers' bunkhouses on the East Claim, which were by any decent standard inadequate, poor ventilation, no medical provisions, 12 men to a space designed for 6. The piece included a comparison with the standards the mining company advertised to its investors in San Francisco and the reality on the ground in Harlan Creek. And it was the kind of comparative journalism that is very hard to dismiss as inaccuracy, because it was nothing but numbers and direct quotes. Franklin Morse, the mine superintendent whose creative bookkeeping Lillian had already exposed, was no longer in Harlan Creek. He had departed hastily in the days after the assay story, and his replacement was a quieter man who had the look of someone hoping to be invisible until things settled down. Amos Headley had written a letter to the mining company's San Francisco office and forwarded Lillian's piece, which had put the company in the uncomfortable position of having to respond publicly or appear to confirm it by silence. Sheriff Pruitt's hostility had become more open. He had spoken to Roy directly one afternoon in front of the saloon, in the manner of a man delivering a message through an intermediary, and told him that Miss Boone was making enemies above his weight class, and that it would be a shame if a man got caught in someone else's falling timber. Roy had looked at Pruitt for a long, quiet moment, and then said that he appreciated the concern, and returned his attention to the horse he was saddling, and Pruitt had ridden away. Roy told Lillian about the conversation that Thursday because he thought she should know. They were at the Gazette office, the coffee between them, and she listened with her full attention and did not look afraid. "Above his weight class," she repeated. "That's interesting. That's Pruitt telling me he doesn't control it, he's delivering a message from someone else. Headley, maybe, or someone in the mining company," she was thinking, her pencil moving idly on a proof sheet. "They haven't done anything since the window. I think they're not sure what kind of woman I am yet." "What kind are you?" She looked up at him. "The kind who doesn't leave." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." Something passed between them in that moment, not for the first time and with increasing directness each time, and Lillian set her pencil down and said, "Roy." "Yes. I want to say something plainly and I want you to receive it the same way." "All right," he said. "I think about you," she said. "More than as strictly, I think about you the way a person thinks about someone they want in their life. Not just in their office on Thursdays and at supper on Saturdays. In their life." He was very still, the way he went still when something mattered. "I'm a ranch hand," he said. "I don't have much to—" "I'm not asking what you have," she said. "I'm telling you what I feel." "Those are different conversations." He leaned forward, his elbows on the work table, and looked at her very directly. "I've been thinking about you since the first day," he said. "Since you told Fitch he owed money before you'd even put down your bag." She laughed again, that wonderful unguarded laugh, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and it was a simple thing, the pressure of his hand over hers, but it was the most direct and honest thing either of them had done in weeks of being careful around each other, and it was very much better than careful. They sat like that for a while, her hand in his on the ink-stained work table, and the Gazette office around them was perfectly quiet. June came in hot and dry, as June did in Nevada, and the days lengthened and the town's rhythms shifted to accommodate the heat, and Roy and Lillian fell into the easy gravity of two people who have decided on each other with their whole minds. He was in town on Thursdays and Saturdays without fail. She sometimes rode out to the Whitmore Ranch on a Sunday, ostensibly with a story angle, but in reality because 6 miles on horseback in the morning was worth it when the destination included an hour with Roy on the fence by the paddock, talking about everything and nothing. The Whitmore Ranch hands had formed opinions. Most of them were positive. Roy Graves was a man they trusted, and if he had chosen a woman who was, frankly, the most interesting person to arrive in Harlan Creek in their memory, this seemed consistent with the kind of judgment he generally showed. Old Pete Whitmore himself, a leathery man of 60 who had seen a great deal and was largely impervious to other people's business, had watched Lillian ride up once on her black mare, shaken her hand and said, "The paper's good. Glad you're staying." This was, Roy told her later, the equivalent in Whitmore's vocabulary of a long and enthusiastic endorsement. The stories kept coming. Lillian wrote about the water rights dispute on the south edge of town, about the school that had been running with 2 grade levels in a single room, because the new schoolhouse had been approved and funded 18 months ago, and the materials had not been ordered. She wrote about 2 families who had been pushed off their claims on the north side with paperwork that a lawyer in Reno. She had ridden to Reno and back in 3 days, which was 40-some miles of hard riding each way, told her was of dubious legality. She wrote about all of it in the same clear, factual voice, naming names when the facts warranted it, and not naming them when they didn't. The town was reading the Gazette the way people read a thing that has become necessary, as though it would be dangerous not to know what it contained. Subscriptions had doubled from Herschel's last year. A man in Culver had started ordering copies. A letter came from the editor of a paper in Reno saying he had read her mind piece and thought it was the finest county journalism he had seen in Nevada in 5 years. The pushback continued in the form of small pressures, advertising withdrawn and then replaced by other advertisers. A rumor started and then killed. The boarded window replaced with new glass, and 2 weeks later a brick thrown through the new glass in the night. This time Roy was furious in the quiet way that was more alarming than any display, and he came to town the morning after and helped Lillian replace the glass himself, working in silence for an hour, and when it was done he held her face in both his hands and looked at her. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Then I'm going to speak to Prout." "Don't," she said. "Lillian, not yet. I have something I'm working on. If you confront Prout now, he goes quiet and I lose the thread." She put her hands over his. "Trust me." He looked at her for a long moment. "I trust you," he said. What she was working on was the most significant story she would write in Harlan Creek, and it had come together over weeks of careful listening, and a visit she had made to the county courthouse in Reno, where the deed records were kept. What she had found, in the dense language of official documents, was the following. Sheriff Dale Prout had acquired, over the past 3 years, 5 parcels of land adjacent to the Whitmore Ranch and to 3 other established properties in the area. He had acquired them at prices far below market value. He had acquired them in the months directly following a pattern of pressure, harassment, and legal maneuver that Lillian could document through records and testimony. He had acquired them from families who had come to him for help and instead found themselves the subject of escalating trouble. One of those families was the Coopers, who had left Harlan Creek 2 years ago and whose name Roy remembered, because he had worked their fence line 1 season and Bill Cooper had been a decent man who had seemed, to Roy's eye, to go from a standing start to selling his claim and leaving town in the space of about 8 months, which had struck him as odd, and which he had filed away without knowing what to do with. She told Roy all of this on a Sunday evening at the Gazette office, laying out the documents on the work table, walking him through it the way she would walk a reader through it step by step, fact by fact, building the picture deliberately. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time looking at the documents. "Bill Cooper," he said finally. "He told me he was leaving for California, didn't say much more. He would have told you even less if Prout had been in his ear about what happened to people who talked. How long do you need?" "I need to speak to 2 more people. One of them is a woman named Ruth Halsey who moved to Carson City. I'm riding out Tuesday morning." "Carson City, is that 60 miles?" "Yes." He looked at her. "I'm coming with you." "Roy, I'm not interfering with your story," he said firmly. "I'm riding 60 miles of open country with you, because that's the kind of ride where something can happen on the road that isn't connected to your story at all, and I'm not going to sit here." She looked at him and saw the particular quality in his face that meant there was no negotiation available and that the reason for it was not stubbornness but something that came from a deeper place. "Love," she thought, with a clarity that was new. "That is what this is." "All right," she said, "but I do the talking." "I know," he said. They rode to Carson City and back over 3 days, camping one night on the road each direction, And these 3 days would be something that Lillian thought about for the rest of her life, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the completeness of them. The days riding through the Nevada landscape with the sky enormous overhead and the sage-flat valley stretched before them, talking about everything or riding in the comfortable silence that is only possible between people who do not need to perform for each other. The evenings by the small fire, cooking plain food and drinking coffee, and watching the stars assemble themselves over the desert. The night they were camped in a hollow off the road, a coyote calling somewhere east of them, and Roy said quietly, "I'd like to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "I know this is a particular time and a particular situation," he said. "And I know you've got work to do that matters to you and that I would never ask you to set aside." He was looking at the fire, not at her. "But I'd like, when things settle, I'd like for us to, I want to know that you'd consider," he stopped. And she could see that Roy Graves, who was generally very precise with the words he chose, was struggling with these ones because they carried more weight than he usually asked words to carry. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't finished." "I know what you're asking," she said. "And yes, when things settle, yes." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, and they sat like that by the fire until it burned low, and the desert night was full of the sounds of crickets and distant water and the settling of the earth, and it was very good. Ruth Halsey in Carson City told Lillian everything she needed. Ruth was a woman of 50, practical and plain-spoken, who had left Harlan Creek when Pruitt had made it clear that her refusal to sell would have consequences for her son, who worked in the mine. She had the documentation, the letters, the notices, a signed statement from a man who had since died but whose words Ruth had witnessed and kept. She gave Lillian everything, sitting at her kitchen table in Carson City with the look of a woman who has been waiting for this particular visitor. The story ran on a Tuesday in late June, and it was 8 columns and took the entire front page and half of the second. It named Pruitt by full name and title. It listed every parcel of land, every family who had been pressured, every dollar of the deals. It included the land deed records from the courthouse in Reno, reproduced in summary with page and file references so that anyone who doubted could verify. It included Ruth Halsey's testimony. It included the memory of Bill Cooper, who Lillian had written to in California and who had replied with a letter that she printed in full with his permission. The story did not accuse Pruitt of a crime in terms that exceeded what the evidence supported. What it did was lay out the evidence with such completeness and precision that the conclusion was unavoidable, and it ended with a simple sentence. The residents of Harlan Creek deserved a sheriff whose interest in their property extended no further than their protection. Pruitt was in the Gazette office by 7 that Tuesday morning, before the paper had been out for an hour, and he was not performing magnanimous patience. He was angry, the large, indignant anger of a man who has been operating on the understanding that he will not be held accountable, and who has suddenly encountered evidence that this understanding was wrong. Lillian was at her press, cleaning the type, when he came in. "This is lies," he said. "The records are at the courthouse in Reno," she said. "The file references are in the story. You don't know what you've done." "I've reported public records and sworn testimony," she said. "That's what I do." He took a step toward her and the door behind him opened and Roy Graves came in. He had been in town since before dawn. Not because he'd known Pruitt would come, he hadn't. Not exactly. But because the paper was coming out on Tuesday and he had understood, with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, that this story was larger than the others and that he wanted to be close. He stood in the doorway of the Gazette office, and his presence changed the room the way the presence of a very steady, very capable man changes a room when things are close to tipping. "Miss Boone," Roy said calmly, "is there a problem here?" Pruitt turned. He looked at Roy the way a man looks at something that has just made his calculation more complicated. "This doesn't concern you, Graves." "I'm asking Miss Boone," Roy said. Lillian looked from Pruitt to Roy. "The sheriff was just leaving," she said. Pruitt looked at both of them, and he was weighing things, what he could do, what it would cost him, who was watching. He turned and walked out without another word, and the door swung closed behind him. Roy looked at Lillian. She was holding her composure very well, but her hands were very still on the type tray, and he had come to know that stillness. "Come here," he said, and she crossed the office, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment and let out a long, slow breath. "I'm all right," she said, muffled. "I know," he said. The story's consequences moved quickly. The county sheriff's office received 3 separate formal complaints about Pruitt's land acquisitions within the week, including one from Amos Headley, who had been watching the situation recalculate and decided that being associated with a corrupt sheriff was a greater liability than the annoyance of an honest newspaper. A territorial attorney arrived in Harlan Creek 2 weeks later to begin an investigation. Pete Calloway and his fellow miners testified. Ruth Halsey wrote from Carson City, confirming her willingness to appear before any competent authority. By the end of July, Dale Pruitt had resigned as sheriff of Harlan Creek under a cloud of official inquiry. It was not a full accounting, the mechanisms of frontier justice being what they were, and several of the land transactions falling into legally ambiguous territory. But it was real consequence, and it was public, and the families who had been pressured knew what had been done to them had been documented and named. A new temporary sheriff was appointed, a quiet man named Alvarez who had ridden for the territorial marshal's office and who shook Lillian's hand on his first day in Harlan Creek and said that he hoped they would have a good professional relationship, by which she understood that he meant he intended to be the kind of official who could be written about honestly without either party suffering for it. Clara Yee stopped Lillian on the street the week after Pruitt's resignation and pressed her hands between her own. "My husband wants me to tell you," Clara said, "that the wall has been clean for 6 weeks. Whatever was coming, it stopped coming." Lillian understood. The broken windows had stopped. The nighttime visits had stopped. The pressure had eased the way pressure eases when the person directing it is no longer in a position to direct it. Harlan Creek was not transformed. It was still a frontier town with the inequities and frictions that came with that, but something had shifted in its center of gravity. In August, Roy came to the Gazette on a Thursday evening, and they sat on the step outside the office in the early dark, drinking the coffee he'd brought, and he said, "I've been thinking about something. Tell me." "The Whitmore land is good land," he said, "but it's not. I've been talking to old Pete. He's willing to sell a parcel on the north side. 30 acres, 2 water rights on a spring-fed creek, good grass." He paused. "A man could put up a house on it, a substantial one." Lillian looked at him. The August evening was warm and the street was quiet, and she could hear, faint from 2 streets over, the sounds of Harlan Creek at its easy evening business. "A man and his wife," she said, "if she'd have him." She turned to face him fully. He was looking at her with that steady, direct gaze that had first made her trust him, the gaze of a person who did not look away from what was true. "I'd have him," she said. He reached into his vest pocket and brought out a ring, a plain silver band with a small stone the color of pale sage, which he had ordered from a jeweler in Reno 4 weeks ago, because he was a man who, once he'd made a decision, committed to it. He had measured the ring size by memory, by the number of times he'd held her hand, and he would say later that this was either a sign of attentiveness or an excessive amount of time spent thinking about a woman's hand, and she would say it was clearly both. It fit perfectly. "Lillian Boone," he said. "Roy Graves," she said. He kissed her for the first time there on the step of the Gazette office, on a warm August evening in 1878 in Harlan Creek, Nevada. And it was a thorough and sincere kiss that said everything that needed to be said, and several things they hadn't gotten to yet. They were married in October, in the small white church at the north end of Harlan Creek, where Reverend Mills presided with the quiet, genuine pleasure of a man who had watched both of these people arrive in their individual solitudes, and was happy to see the end of that. Martha Mills had organized the church flowers. Clara Yee had made a cake that was by any standard the best cake anyone had eaten in Harlan Creek in recent memory. Pete Calloway came in from the mine in his good clothes and stood in the back because he was not a man for sitting in church. But he was there. Old Pete Whitmore sat in the front pew with the dignity of a man attending something that confirmed his better judgment. Lillian wore a cream dress she had bought in Reno on one of her reporting trips because she had known even then, though she had not yet admitted it to herself so explicitly, that she was going to need it. She carried a small bunch of sage and late-season wildflowers. Roy stood at the front of the church in clean, dark clothes looking, for the first time in anyone's memory, entirely at ease in a room full of people. They said their vows to each other with the directness that characterized everything between them, not the formal performance of the words but the genuine weight of them, each one, as though they'd written them themselves, which in a way they had, having lived toward them for 7 months of honesty. The house went up on the north parcel of the Whitmore land through the fall, Roy building it through the weeks with help from the ranch hands and from Pete Calloway on weekends. A solid 2-story structure with good windows that let in the morning light, and a wide front porch that looked west across the valley to where the hills went blue in the distance. Lillian rode out every Sunday and watched it rise and contributed her opinions freely, particularly regarding the placement of the large desk she intended to have in the room off the kitchen that would serve as her working office, where she would write and edit the Gazette, because she kept the Gazette. The office on Main Street stayed. It had to, for the press and typesetting and the business of printing. But she hired a young man named Teddy Marsh, 17, who had been sweeping floors at the Gazette since she arrived, and who had turned out to have a genuine instinct for the work and a willingness to learn that reminded her of herself at 13. By the time the house was finished, Teddy could set type and run a proof and had written 2 brief news items that were factual, clear, and required only minor editing, and she had told him directly that if he kept on this way, he would be a first-rate reporter. They moved into the house in November, with the first cold weather coming down from the mountains and the valley turning gold and rust, and the sky going the particular deep blue of a desert fall. Roy carried her over the threshold, which she had not asked for but which she found, to her own mild surprise, entirely perfect. They stood in the empty house with its smell of fresh lumber and plaster and heard the quiet of it around them, and Roy said, "This is ours," and Lillian said, "Yes," and they stood together at the window that looked west and watched the hills go blue in the November light. The winter was good, the kind of winter that is good because of what it contains rather than because of its weather, which was harsh in the way of Nevada winters and not particularly accommodating. But the house was warm and well built, and Lillian worked at her desk in the mornings and went to the Gazette office in town 3 days a week, and Roy's days on the ranch ended at the fence line visible from their kitchen window, and the evenings were long and full of fire and conversation, and the particular happiness of 2 people who have found in each other a home that is more reliable than any building. In the spring of 1879, Lillian told Roy she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning while he was making coffee, and she was at the window watching the first green come back to the valley, and she said it simply, the way she said everything, without preamble or ceremony. He set down the coffee and turned and looked at her for a moment that was very still, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her with a care and completeness that was different from everything before it, not less strong but deeper, as though he were holding something that contained everything he had decided his life was for. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Are you happy?" She pulled back just far enough to look at him. "Roy Graves," she said, "I'm the happiest woman in Nevada." He laughed, a real full laugh, the kind that he rarely let out, and she loved the sound of it in the new house in the spring morning with the coffee going cold on the stove. The Gazette continued through the spring and summer of 1879 with increasing reach and reputation. Teddy Marsh had grown into the work with the speed of someone finding their calling, and Lillian had begun teaching him not just the mechanics of the press, but the principles of the work, the obligation to accuracy, the distinction between editorial opinion and factual reporting, the particular responsibility of being the only newspaper in a town where what you printed was what people knew. He was a serious student and a good one, and by midsummer he was effectively managing the office on the 3 days a week Lillian was at the house, which suited Lillian because as summer moved toward fall and the baby grew, she found the 6-mile ride to town increasingly demanding. Roy drove her in the buggy now, which she had accepted without argument because it was practical, and also because she found that the morning ride with him, the two of them on the buggy seat with the valley opening before them and the horse at an easy trot, was one of the better parts of her day. They talked about the paper and the ranch and the baby and the town and the large and small matters of the world, and sometimes they did not talk at all, and that was equally good. Amos Headley, whose relationship with the Gazette had evolved into something close to genuine respect, stopped Roy on the street one August morning and said, not unkindly, "You've got a remarkable wife, Graves." Roy said he was aware of this. Headley said the town was better for having her, and Roy said he thought so too, and Headley extended his hand and Roy shook it, and it was the kind of moment that closes something that had been open. Thomas Yee, who had watched the year unfold with the particular attentiveness of a man who has learned to pay close attention to which way the wind of public opinion is blowing, had made a decision that spring to expand his laundry business. He had come to Lillian for advice about the property arrangements. There had been a question about the title on the lot next to his current building, and Lillian had written up the situation in her legal correspondence notebook and sent a letter to the Reno attorney, and the matter had resolved cleanly. Thomas Yee had shaken her hand and looked at her with the full weight of his gratitude, which was not expressed in many words but was completely clear. The new schoolhouse had been completed in June. The construction finally commenced after Lillian's story on the funding delay, and completed 3 months later when it became evident that the town was paying attention. The school year of 1879 began with both grade levels in their own rooms, and the new teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Catherine Brooks, had come to the Gazette on her first day in Harlan Creek to introduce herself, and Lillian had recognized in her eyes the particular expression of a woman arriving in a new place and deciding whether it was going to hold. "It's a good town," Lillian had told her. "It needs people who'll do their work honestly and not be pushed around." Catherine Brooks had looked at her with something like relief and said, "That's me." Roy and Lillian's son was born on the 23rd of October, 1879, 2 days earlier than the doctor had predicted, in the bedroom of the house on the north parcel of the old Whitmore land. Roy was present for it, which was not the common arrangement. Most men were sent to wait in another room, but Lillian had told him she wanted him there, and he had said without hesitation that he would be. He held her hand through the long hours of it, and the doctor said afterward to his wife that in 20 years of deliveries he had never seen a man so wholly concentrated on another person's well-being as Roy Graves had been through that night. The boy was born at 3 in the morning, loudly and emphatically, with the full-lunged announcement of a person who has decided that the world should know he has arrived. Roy held him first, because Lillian's hands were shaking and she asked Roy to take him while she steadied, and Roy stood at the window with the baby in his arms and looked down at the small, new, furious face, and felt something so large and wordless that he could only stand very still and let it move through him. "He has your eyes," Lillian said from the bed, her voice rough and exhausted and more full of love than anything. Roy looked up. His eyes were wet, which he did not try to hide. "How can you tell yet?" "I can tell," she said. "Come bring him here." They named him Henry Webb Graves Henry for no particular family reason, except that it was a good, solid name that suited the heft and gravity of the small person who had arrived to bear it, and Webb for Herschel Webb, because the uncle who had built the Gazette and trusted his niece to keep it honest deserved a name in the next generation. Henry was a good baby, and then a good toddler, and then a very energetic small boy. And he grew up in the house on the valley with the sound of a printing press in the background of his life, the way other children grew up with the sound of a mill or a forge. He followed his father on the ranch and his mother in the Gazette office with equal enthusiasm, which meant that by the age of 3, he had opinions about both cattle and typeface. And Lillian wrote a small piece in the Gazette about this that was the first and only piece she ever wrote that was purely personal, and Roy cut it out and kept it in the inside pocket of his good coat. The Gazette's reputation continued to grow through the early 1880s. A paper in San Francisco reprinted Lillian's Prout investigation, with full credit and her permission, and it was cited in a territorial legislative debate about the oversight of local law enforcement. The territorial marshal wrote to Lillian directly to thank her for the documentation that had supported the investigation. She wrote back a practical, brief reply that Roy proofread and told her was characteristically modest. "I'm not modest," she said, slightly offended. "No," he agreed, "but the letter is. You have a way of writing about yourself differently than you write about everything else." She thought about this. "I suppose I do," she said. "I know how to write myself clearly when it matters. But I'm not used to it mattering about me personally." He looked at her. "It matters to me," he said, "personally." She shook her head at him, but she was smiling. By 1882, Teddy Marsh was the Gazette's full editor, and Lillian had moved to the role her uncle Herschel had technically held, publisher and owner, which meant she remained the final word on everything that mattered, while Teddy handled the daily operations with a competence that she took quiet pride in. She still wrote herself long pieces, investigative pieces, occasional editorials, but the paper was no longer dependent on her being at the office every day, which suited the reality of a household with a 3-year-old, and the discovery, in the spring of 1882, that Henry was going to have company. Roy heard this news in the kitchen again, coffee in hand again, and again set it down and crossed the kitchen, and again held her with the full completeness of a man for whom this was the best possible information. He was a year older than he'd been the first time, and it had settled into him, the happiness. It was not the sharp, bright surprise of the first year, but something steadier and deeper, like water that has found its level. "2," he said. "2," she confirmed. "We should tell Henry." "He won't know what we're talking about." "He'll know something's happening," Roy said. "He watches things." Lillian smiled. "He gets that from you." "He gets it from both of us," Roy said. "He gets the watching from me and the understanding from you." Their daughter was born in November of 1882, as loudly and decisively as her brother had been, and they named her Clara Ruth Clara for Clara Yee, who had been as close as an aunt to Lillian in the 4 years since her arrival, and Ruth for Ruth Halsey of Carson City, who had given her testimony freely and helped bring an honest accounting to Harlan Creek. It seemed to Lillian that the names you gave your children were a kind of declaration of what you thought was worth honoring, and these 2 women had earned it. Henry, who was 3.5 and had been told in careful detail that a baby was coming, received his sister with the expression of a person who has been told about a thing in theory and is now confronting it in practice and finding the reality considerably more noisy and demanding than the theory had suggested. He adjusted over the course of a week, with the pragmatic flexibility of small children, and by the end of the 2nd week, he had appointed himself her guardian in the way of small boys. Not gentle, exactly, but deeply proprietary, and Roy watched this development with the profound amusement of a man watching his child have an experience he recognizes. The town of Harlan Creek moved through the 1880s with the steady pace of a frontier settlement that had found its footing. The silver was declining, as silver did, but the town had diversified cattle, agriculture, some light industry, and the families who stayed were the families who had decided to make something real of the place. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 cast a shadow that Lillian wrote about directly and without comfort, noting the reality of what it meant for families like the Yis, and for the dozens of Chinese workers in the county who had built roads and railroads and mines, and been told that their contribution was acceptable, but their presence was not. Thomas Yi read her editorial and came to the Gazette office and said nothing, but shook her hand for a long time, and she understood what the silence meant and received it. The world beyond Harlan Creek was changing with the velocity that characterizes the last 2 decades of any century, and Lillian wrote about all of it: the railroad expansion, the cattle industry's evolving economics, the long-running question of women's suffrage, which Wyoming Territory had granted in 1869, and which moved with geological slowness toward the rest of the nation. She had opinions on this. Roy had read her opinions, agreed with them, and said so, which she told him once was one of the things she loved most about him, and he said she was welcome and went back to reading the piece. On an evening in the spring of 1884, they sat on the front porch of the house in the long Nevada dusk, Henry in bed, Clara asleep in her basket between them, the valley going golden and quiet in the last light. The hills to the west were the blue-purple of early evening, and the sage smelled clean after an afternoon rain, and Roy had his coffee and Lillian had hers, and neither of them was talking, which was the particular language of 2 people who have been talking to each other for 6 years and know that silence between them is a form of communication, not its absence. "I've been thinking about something," Roy said eventually. "Tell me. I want to buy more land. Pete's son is selling the parcel on the west side. It runs down to the creek and it's good grass, spring-fed, protected from the north wind by the rock formation." He paused. "I want to expand the operation. Cattle and maybe horses. I think there's a market in the next 10 years for good breeding stock as the territory settles." Lillian turned to look at him. He had the thoughtful, forward-looking expression he wore when he was building something in his mind, and she knew it well and trusted it absolutely. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since last year, since the Cooper parcel came back on the market." A pause. "The Cooper's son is selling it, Bill Cooper's boy in California. He doesn't want it, never did. It came back to him through the family and he wants to see it go to someone who'll work it. That's the land Prout tried to take from his father," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I think that's exactly right," she said. "I think you should buy it." He nodded slowly. "And I think," she added, "that you should tell Bill Cooper's son that his father's land is being properly cared for. I plan to write him well." "Help me," he said. She smiled. "You don't need help." "I write better when you've read it," he said, which was a kind of compliment that was also a kind of love. And she reached across the basket where Clara slept and took his hand, the way she did, and they sat in the last light of the Nevada evening with the valley laid before them and the house behind them and the children sleeping inside. Henry Graves, at 7, could already read the Gazette with fluency and had developed, to both his parents' amusement and pride, a habit of pointing out when 2 stories seemed to contradict each other. He had Roy's watching eyes and Lillian's direct tongue, and a curious, energetic mind that was entirely his own. He had decided he wanted to be a rancher and a newspaper man, and when told that this would be difficult to achieve simultaneously, he had looked at both his parents with the expression of someone who found this assessment unpersuasive. Clara, at 2, was a serious, observant child who watched the world with large, dark eyes and formed opinions about it before she could fully express them. She followed her father around the paddock with the focused patience of a born stockwoman. She sat on her mother's lap at the typesetting case and touched the letters with careful fingers, not pulling them out, just touching them, as though learning the alphabet by contact. Roy and Lillian had built something. Not just the house, not just the land, not just the paper, though all of those were real and good and daily evidence of what 2 people can make when they bring their whole selves to the work. They had built a life that was consistent with who they were, truthful, practical, generous to the people around them, not naive about injustice but not defeated by it. The Gazette published its 100th issue in the fall of 1880, and Lillian had written an editorial marking the occasion that was not about herself, but about what a newspaper was for. She had written, "A newspaper exists to make the invisible visible and to hold the powerful accountable to the people they hold power over. It does this through the simplest possible means, which is accuracy. A fact stated plainly is more powerful than any editorial, more durable than any opinion, and more dangerous to corruption than anything I know." Herschel Webb built this press and kept this paper for 20 years, and in his best work he understood this, and it is in his best work that I find my inheritance and my obligation. She had not been able to read it aloud at the small celebration Teddy organized without her voice going rough, and Roy had been there and had seen it and had not said anything, only put his hand at the small of her back in the quiet way that meant "I see you." The Prout investigation had resulted, by 1881, in a full territorial inquiry that found 2 instances of fraud that could be prosecuted and several more that fell into legal gray areas. Prout himself had moved out of Nevada entirely. Lillian heard he had gone to Arizona, and the land he had acquired through pressure and intimidation was gradually returned through the territorial courts to the families from whom it had been taken, or their heirs, or sold with the proceeds distributed. It was not perfect justice. The years those families had spent away from their land and their community could not be compensated in dollar terms, but it was real, and it was more than most such situations produced, and Lillian had written about it when it concluded with the same clarity she had brought to the beginning. Clara Yee wrote to Lillian from Harlan Creek. She had taken to writing letters even though they lived 5 miles apart, because she said some things were better written. To say that she felt the town had turned a corner, and that she thought Lillian was the corner. Lillian wrote back that a corner turns because the road does, not because of any single person, but that she was grateful for the metaphor. In the summer of 1885, Roy came in from the Cooper parcel, his parcel now, properly purchased and renamed in the deed as Graves Creek Ranch, which was what the natural spring-fed creek on the property warranted, with a cut on his arm from a fence wire, and a story about a young stallion he'd acquired from a breeder in Utah that went on for so long and with so much detail and evident pleasure that Lillian set down her pencil and gave him her complete attention, which he noticed and appreciated with a small, private smile. "I think he's worth breeding," Roy said. "He sounds extraordinary." "He's complicated," Roy said. "He doesn't trust easily, but once he does," he stopped. Lillian looked at him. "Once he does," he met her eyes. There was something in his expression that was both entirely present and very far away, a man looking at 2 things simultaneously, the horse in his mind's eye and the woman in front of him. "Once he does, he's loyal," he said. "Completely." "He sounds," she said slowly, "like someone I know." His mouth curved. "I was thinking the same thing." She stood up from the desk, and she crossed the kitchen to where he stood, and she put her hands on his face the way he had once put his hands on hers in the doorway of the Gazette office after the window was broken, and she looked at him with those clear gray-green eyes that had been steady and true since the day she stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek. "Roy Graves," she said. "Lillian Boone Graves," he said, and the full name, hers and his together, was something he said with a particular attention, as though each time he said it he was acknowledging something he never quite took for granted. She kissed him there in the kitchen, and the afternoon light through the window fell warm on both of them, and outside Henry was calling something about a fence, and Clara was probably following the young stallion around the paddock with her characteristic focused patience, and the valley was wide and golden, and the hills went blue in the distance, and the life they had built together was full and sound and good. Teddy Marsh ran the Gazette well into the next decade, and Lillian contributed to it throughout her life. The long investigative pieces for which she became, in time, modestly famous across Nevada, the editorials on suffrage and land rights, and the conditions of Chinese workers, and a dozen other subjects that she returned to because they were true and important and not finished. And occasional pieces about Harlan Creek itself, its growth and its changes, its people, written with the particular care of someone who has decided to love a place in full knowledge of its flaws. The Cooper parcel, Graves Creek Ranch, thrived under Roy's management. The horses were his pride, the cattle his steady income, and the land itself was something he moved over every day with the ease of a man who has found the exact place he belongs in the world. He taught Henry to work it and to read it, to understand the grass and the water and the seasons, to know which land was generous and which was not, to care for an animal with the attention it deserved. Clara turned out, by the time she was 12, to have an instinct for horses that exceeded even her father's, which Roy regarded with enormous satisfaction and only the mildest competitive feeling. The schoolhouse that Lillian's story had finally brought to completion educated their children and the children of the town through the years, and Catherine Brooks taught there for 11 years before she married the Newtown doctor and became Catherine Brooks Vargas, and she and Lillian remained close friends until old age, a friendship built on the particular bond of two women who had arrived in the same town in the same year with the same decision in their eyes. Thomas and Clara Yee remained in Harlan Creek. Thomas expanded his business twice. Their sons grew into steady men who worked hard and made themselves indispensable in the ways of people who know they have to be excellent because they will be given no room for ordinary. The Yees and the Graves families had Sunday dinners together twice a month through the 1880s and into the 1890s, which was its own kind of quiet statement about what kind of town Harlan Creek could be at its best. The years moved with the particular velocity of happy years fast in memory, full in the living. Roy's hair went gray at his temples in his late 30s, and he wore it with the easy indifference of a man who has never been vain. Lillian's eyes were always the same clear gray-green. They argued sometimes, as two people with strong minds and direct tongues will argue, and they resolved their arguments with the same directness, no days of cold silence, no grievances stored up, because both of them had seen what unspoken things do to a life and neither of them was interested in that. Henry Graves, at 18, did both things. He worked the ranch and he wrote for the Gazette, and he was good at both, the way people are when they are doing what they were made for. His first published story was an investigation into the water rights dispute that had been running for years in the county, and it was clear and factual and only needed minor editing. And Lillian read it twice and then went to find Roy and said, "He's better than I was at his age." And Roy said, "I know." And they looked at each other with the full weight of what it means to watch someone you love become who they were going to be. Clara, at 16, was already riding the stallion's colts in ways that made visiting breeders stop and watch. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness, and she had a future ahead of her that was entirely her own, which was exactly as it should be. On a morning in the autumn of 1892, 14 years after a stagecoach had rolled into Harlan Creek in a cloud of red dust, Roy saddled Dusk's successor, a steady brown horse named Twice, so named because Roy had bought him and returned him to the seller and then gone back and bought him again, a story that Henry loved, and rode the perimeter of Graves Creek Ranch in the early morning, the way he did most mornings. The light came gold over the eastern hills, and the valley lay below him in the long, clear light of an October day, and the smoke was rising from the chimney of the house, and Lillian was at her desk in the morning room writing, which he knew because he had looked back before he'd ridden out and seen the lamp. He rode the fence line that had been Cooper's fence line, that was now his, properly and honestly his, and he thought about Bill Cooper's son who had written back to Roy's letter with a long reply full of relief that the land would be in good hands. He thought about Calloway, who had died the year before of a lung sickness that was the common end of too many years in the mine, and whose funeral had been the largest Harlan Creek had seen. He thought about Herschel Webb, who had built the press and left it to a woman who would use it honestly, which was a form of wisdom he appreciated more with every year. He rode back to the house and came into the kitchen, and Lillian was there now, the writing done for the morning, making coffee with the focused competence she brought to even the most ordinary tasks. She turned when he came in. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He hung his hat and crossed the kitchen and kissed her, not perfunctory, not habit, but the deliberate present kiss of a man who was paying attention, and she put her hand on his chest and leaned into it. "The valley's beautiful this morning," he said. "I saw from the window," she said. "Did you finish the piece?" "Almost. I need another paragraph. I know what I want to say, I just haven't found the sentence yet." "You'll find it," he said. "I know," she said. "You just have to wait sometimes for the right words." He smiled at her. She smiled back. The coffee was ready, and the morning was clear, and the valley was gold outside the window. And the house was full of everything they had built together. The evidence of it, the living history of it, the ongoing present tense of it. And Roy Graves stood in the kitchen of his home with his wife and thought, as he thought every morning with a gratitude that was too large for words, that he was the luckiest man in Nevada. And Lillian Boone, who had arrived in Harlan Creek with nothing but the truth and the determination to tell it, who had been told in 100 ways by 100 men that her presence was inconvenient and her voice was unwelcome, who had found in this unlikely place and this unlikely man something that was more than a home, a genuine companionship, a real love, a life she would have chosen 10 times over, sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and found the sentence she'd been looking for. And wrote it down, and it was exactly right. Outside, Harlan Creek went about its business in the October morning. The Gazette Press was already running on Main Street, where Teddy Marsh was printing Tuesday's issue. The schoolhouse was open, the children arriving in the clear autumn air. Thomas Yee's Laundry had a line of customers. The mountains to the east were already showing the first white of the season's snow. The town was not perfect. No town is. But it was honest about more things than it used to be, and it knew who had made it so, and that knowledge had settled into the daily life of Harlan Creek, the way good water settles into good soil, quietly, thoroughly, in a way that cannot be undone. And in the house on the north parcel of the old Whitmore land, now Graves Creek Ranch, Roy poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside his wife and sat across from her, and the morning opened before them, full and unhurried and entirely their own.